Well, I must say to you that I have become fascinated by chapter 1 in the Gospel of Luke. And this is a chapter that oftentimes we rush past in order to get to the wonderful Christmas narrative in chapter 2. And so we don't pay a lot of attention to it. But I've started reading it, and I have found it to be extraordinarily rich and deep, and with wonderful lessons to be learned. So today and next week we're going to be preaching from chapter 1 of Luke. Today will be about Zechariah. Next week will be about Gabriel's visit to Mary, the mother of Jesus. So we're not going to put this up there today. I'm going to ask you to pull out your personal Bible or a pew Bible and read it this way, because I want you, if at all possible, to read this at least once between now and next Sunday. Maybe you would read it every day, just because I want you to learn to love this chapter as I have come to. And believe me, I've come to it in old age. Today we're going to read, beginning with verse 5. We're going to read the story of Zechariah. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. His wife was a descendant of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Both of them were righteous before God, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. But they had no children because Elizabeth was barren, and both were getting on in years. Now, let me just give you a hint. This first chapter is about these interwoven relationships of people who preceded Jesus. So, Elizabeth, you may or may not know this, was a relative of Mary. I always thought she was a cousin, but when you read this carefully, it doesn't say that. It's not that specific. It just says she was a relative. First cousin of one, once removed. I never could figure that out. But she was probably a cousin of some kind, but she's a relative of Mary. So just keep that in mind. Once when Zechariah was serving as priest before God and his section was on duty, he was a very religious man, a leader in the synagogue. He was chosen by lot according to the custom of the priesthood to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and offer incense. Now at the time of the incense offering, the whole assembly of the people was praying outside. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was terrified. That's a theme throughout the Old and New Testaments. You'll see it over and over again in the story of Christmas. You'll see it in the story of the cross and the resurrection. It's an extraordinarily important theme, and you'll also find this theme where the angel says, "Do not be afraid." So there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was terrified, and fear overwhelmed him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John. You will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He must never drink wine or strong drink. Even before his birth, he will be filled with the Holy Spirit. He will turn many of the people of Israel to the Lord of their God. With the spirit and power of Elijah, he will go before him to turn the hearts of parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." And Zechariah said to the angel, "How will I know that this is so? For I am an old man and my wife is getting on in years." Here's another theme. You find it throughout the Bible, beginning with Abraham and Sarah in the book of Genesis. The older couple, the barren wife, the visitation of God, the arrival of a child. You'll see it throughout the Old Testament and 2 or 3 times in the New Testament. And Zechariah said to the angel, "How will I know that this is so? For I'm an old man and my wife is getting on in years." And the angel replied, "I am Gabriel." Do you pick this up as I do, that the angel was a little bit irritated by being questioned? I don't know about you, but I hear this as James Earl Jones. "I am Gabriel. Do not question me," right? I think that's the way it's supposed to read. "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. But now, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time, you will become mute, unable to speak until the day these things occur. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I don't know about you, but I have 1,000 questions about my family's history. 1,000 questions about the little details in my family's history. I know the big stories. I know that one grandfather, the one on my father's side from Tennessee, was a pastor and educated and genteel and perhaps you could even say an elegant man. Whereas my maternal grandfather, the one from Dallas, had a high school education and was a lawman all of his life. Tough as nails. One would not have referred to Bert as elegant or even as genteel. So I have the big stories. It's the little stories that I'm missing, and I so regret this. My parents died relatively young. My father was 61 when he died, and my mother 71. And for some reason, I guess I just wasn't interested enough at the time. Because there's all sorts of details that I wish we had, and nobody took the time to ask the questions or to write it down. So, for instance, my grandparents, how did they meet? I want to know how they met. Which counties did they come from? That's the way it was back in those days, rural America. Did they come from the same county? Did they grow up together? I don't know the answer to that. I just don't. Here's a good one. My grandmother on my mother's side, the one married to the lawman who only had a high school degree, she had a degree from Baylor University in the 1920s, 21, 22, someplace around there. Who ever heard of such a thing? A Texas girl getting a degree from Baylor University in the 1920s. I grew up with her quoting Browning to me. I never thought that was unusual as I was growing up, but now I wonder, how did she happen to get a chance to go to college and get a degree? I have all sorts of questions about the details of my family history. And so that's why I think I've become so captivated by this first chapter of Luke. I mean, Luke, before he gets to the birth narrative of Jesus, he could have easily started with chapter 2. But Luke takes the time to write for us this rather extended chapter 1 with all of the details about what took place in the history of Jesus before he was born. Really, chapter 1 revolves around 3 people and 3 narratives. There's the story of Zechariah that we read just a moment ago, and how God came to Zechariah and the angel Gabriel and announced to him that his barren and older wife Elizabeth would give birth to the one who would become known as John the Baptist. And Zechariah being struck where he could not speak, his voice taken from him because he didn't believe the angel Gabriel. And then there's the story of Elizabeth. If you read on, Elizabeth goes to visit, or Mary goes to visit Elizabeth. I think it's the other way around. Elizabeth goes to visit Mary. Read it, you'll get the details right. I'm kind of confused. And Elizabeth, they're both pregnant. They're both pregnant with children. And then, of course, the story of Mary herself and Gabriel coming to Mary. These wonderful details. And here's a pretty good question, I think. Did Luke have some kind of an editor who maybe read a first draft of his story about Jesus and said, you know, Luke, this is a pretty good story, but it would be so much more interesting if you would add some color to it, some details. Why don't you put some details about the family history? Is that what happened? Or maybe, did Luke decide that somehow the details were important? That what took place in these months preceding the birth of Jesus was extremely important. I think there are 2 different ways of looking at this season of Advent. One is by seeing the season of Advent as a time of waiting and preparation and expectation. I think that's almost how we always look at Advent. We need to spend this time waiting and expecting in order to fully enjoy the day of Christmas. That's not a bad thing to do. Not a bad thing to do at all. If you're going to have a baby, what do? You go get some paint, you paint the nursery, the baby's room or whatever. Somebody throws a shower for you. You start getting ready for the arrival of the baby. That's generally how I've always thought about Advent. But what if Luke is trying to tell us that Advent is something different from that, something more than that, perhaps deeper than that? That Advent is, in fact, the time when God comes to us in very special and spiritual ways. That Advent is the time when lives are transformed. I'll just share with you what my thoughts about this have been. I think, had you gone to Zechariah while he was on his deathbed, in his final hours, and you said, Zechariah, what was the most powerful thing that has ever happened to you in all these years? I don't think he would have told about the birth of Jesus. I think he would have told about the visit from Gabriel, his voice being taken from him. A very spiritual happening, by the way. You know what happened to Paul on the way to Damascus when he too was confronted by God? His eyes were taken from him. It's one of the ways we know it was a deep and powerful and spiritual experience. If you'd asked Elizabeth at the end of her life, what was the most important spiritual moment that you can remember? I think she would have said, it was conceiving my son John. And even Mary, surprise, surprise, even Mary, I'm not sure she would have said, it was that moment at the manger when I laid my baby in front of me. I think she might have said it was the visit from Gabriel. And I said, let it be with me as you will. Such extraordinary and spiritual things that sometimes come to us out of the blue in this season of Advent. Transformational things. And who knows, it might happen to you. You might come here on a Wednesday evening for an Advent service thinking you will take some time to worship, and you might be struck by something that is said in a life-changing way. Or you might hear a piece of music like you're going to hear in a moment. O come, Emmanuel, played in a way you've never heard before, and you might think, that's the music of angels. Or maybe you got one of those Salvation Army angels off the tree up there, and maybe you'll be shopping in Target for a little boy named Miguel, and suddenly realize that angels are present, that your life has been changed by the visitation of an angel named Miguel. I don't know. What kind of amazing thing might happen to you in this season of Advent?